Hello, everyone. Today's GovFocus is going to focus on zero trust with two of the top experts in government and industry. Earlier this year, the White House executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity mandated federal agencies with deploying zero trust architectures to better secure their networks. With us today to discuss the order and other things about zero trust are Don McLean, Chief Cybersecurity Technologist at DLT, a tech data company serving the public sector, and Chris Cleary, Principal Cyber Advisor for the Department of the Navy. So to start off the conversation today, I have a question for both of you. Either one of you can go first. How can the White House executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity help government make new strides in cybersecurity?
I guess I'll kick that off as being the government person on the call. So one of the encouraging things was that there was an executive order that came out that stressed cybersecurity. That's one of the things we were a benefit. So the Department of Defense did not have as many call outs within the executive order as, let's say, the Department of Homeland Security did. But it's driving a lot of initiatives within the department that we're trying to follow through on. Zero trust is a big undertaking, and it's traditionally been so the way we're looking at it through the lens within, let's say, the Department of the Navy. So we have all the things we do in traditional enterprise IT, and we're trying to take a zero trust mindset to things like critical infrastructure and weapon systems for their security. But one of the most encouraging things about this, and I think we had mentioned this as we were discussing on the prep call, is the team of players that are driving these initiatives. When you look at the cast of characters, Chris Inglis, Jen Easterly, myself, we all came from the National Security Agency and Cybercom around the same time. So I'm really encouraged that the people that are driving this have all come. We all know each other. We're all kind of cut from the same cloth, and we're all now at least speaking a very similar language. And look, zero trust has got a long way to go within the Department of Defense and across the federal government at large. I know we're going to get into some of the details, obviously. I guess I'll save those for some of the other questions. And Don, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure. Well, my experience with executive orders is that they're important in that they set a tone and that they encourage certain kinds of behaviors. They are technically orders to the government, as their name indicates, executive order. The problem is all too often they come with an intent and an order, but they don't come with the most essential piece of the puzzle, which is money. I don't know if anyone on the call is familiar with HSPD 12, but that was promulgated in 2004 and was supposed to be completed by 2005. And as of 2015, it was still not done. It had to do with something much simpler than zero trust, which was just the ID cards that were supposed to be used throughout the government. That said, I agree with Chris that this one does have something of a different flavor to it, because I think there is a sea change in the attitude towards cybersecurity. People are realizing that what we're doing is not really working. There have been too many breaches. Ask anyone who is, sweating bullets over their vacation about Log4j or Log4j, depending on that's one of the debates is how you pronounce it. But that's just one of many breaches that constantly plagues us. And it's clear that what we're doing now isn't working. So we do need a comprehensive approach from the ground up. My hope is that the executive order will set the tone and set the orientation for all of government, and that the requisite funds and staffing will become available to support that initiative, because it's really important to our nation to make sure that we get this right. It's a whole new world of warfare now, and we have to address it as such.
So I have a question for Cleary, but McLean, feel free to jump in if you'd like. What role does identity management play in cybersecurity at the Department of the Navy? And how does zero trust complement your identity management efforts?
Good question. So the Department of the Navy, like the rest of the Department of Defense, is pursuing an ICAM strategy right now. And we were pursuing this prior to zero trust being a big thing. Strange enough, I think we've all gotten to even our own identity strategies through different ways. The Navy came to the conclusion as we were going through a lot of financial auditing that we found out that we had things for like privileged access, that there were a lot of things that we needed that required an identity strategy to be rolled out to remediate a bunch of audit findings we had within the department. So when Zero Trust came around, we got to change the tone a little bit on why we were doing identity. It wasn't identity to sort of remediate audit findings. Identity is fundamental or foundational to Zero Trust strategy. If you don't have a good identity strategy or a good identity architecture, you're never going to get to a Zero Trust architecture. So they build upon, they're codependent, or you could say identity is a core component of a Zero Trust architecture. There's lots of people that could parse words. But our identity strategy is key to it. So we're beginning to roll an identity strategy or identity solution out this year in 2022. That's something that so prior to coming to my job as the principal cyber advisor, I was the chief information security officer, and I was the sort of the functional owner of our identity strategy across the department. So we're into it. We are sort of following along with the reference architecture that was put out by DISA circa. DISA's been working on this going back to, comment on some of Don's things. We've been working on a reference architecture for identity started in 2014. So the fact that it's now, do math, coming up on 8 years later, and we're actually beginning to roll out a solution you might say it's encouraging on one side that we're finally getting around to it. But when you look at the genesis of this going back almost 8 years, that this has taken us 8 years to get to a certain point. And the good news is Zero Trust and the reason that we're now moving to that is further accelerated our need for identity. So it's not a pet project anymore. It's really moved up to the front of the stack.
I like the word that you were using, foundational. A lot of technologies in Zero Trust are not just foundational to a Zero Trust architecture or approach, they're just foundational to good security. Whether you're Zero Trust or not, it's a good idea to have a strong identity management program in place, which you saw 8 years ago. So a lot of Zero Trust technologies are in fact quite foundational to any good security approach.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add one more little comment. The thing that I used to say, or I'm trying to say is, if you use, I used to use working out as kind of an analogy for this. And you've got people that like to work out and you've got athletes. Athletes are training for performance, and a byproduct of that are all the things that come with good, they eat well. They don't eat to be thin. They eat because it fuels their body and their ability to perform. And I think when we switched our mindset around why we were doing identity, it wasn't, identity to remediate audit findings. It was identity as a byproduct of good strategy will remediate audit findings, will allow us to get to Zero Trust, will allow us to do these other things. So to Don's point, it wasn't, if we figure out that it's just good business to have an identity strategy, it just solves all these other problems. It's byproducts of doing the right thing. And I think we got to move our mindset away from, we've got to do it because it's the right thing to do. And it's foundational to a good security practice, not because, we need to remediate some audit findings. So again, it's a mindset, which then gets to driving resources, right? We're not solving for one problem. We're doing something that's foundational, which then allows more resources to flow to it, because it's not just this, again, I'll use the word pet project. We've moved beyond that.
Yeah, and one of my pet points is that Zero Trust, the goal of Zero Trust isn't to be Zero Trust. The goal of Zero Trust is to make your security program better, right? Yeah. It's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, which I think is part and parcel of what you're saying.
Exactly.
So that actually dovetails pretty nicely into my next question, which is for Don. Can you discuss strategy versus culture when implementing Zero Trust, and what federal agencies should prioritize in order to move the needle on federal cybersecurity?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most essential elements of Zero Trust is that it is, in many ways, an exercise in change management or culture management. For instance, least privilege is one of many, essential elements of Zero Trust. Least privilege means ensuring that all systems and all human users only have the privileges that they absolutely need to perform their duties and to do their jobs. I've been involved in least privilege exercises in my past life before I came to DLT, running cybersecurity programs in various federal agencies. And what you find is that often, because of the hurry to get things done, excessive privileges are granted to someone because that'll work, it'll give them what they need, and you don't have to sit there and parse out all the things that they really don't need. That takes time, it takes effort. And once people have privileges, they feel, well, privileged, they feel important. Rescinding those privileges becomes an exercise in human management and also knowing what they actually need to do their jobs. And it's difficult as someone coming from the outside as a cybersecurity person to walk into someone who knows their job better than you do and tell them you don't really need this to do their job. So, and that's just one example of the kinds of cultural things that you can anticipate being difficult for implementing a zero trust program. Another example is, for instance, if you're implementing new technology, or especially if you're replacing technology with something else, that's always difficult from a contractual standpoint. You have to keep contracts in mind. You have to keep in mind that people on the staff may be trained in these technologies and perhaps have tied their careers to those technologies. If they're changing, there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. So preparing the ground ahead of time, not just for agencies, but for any organization that wants to do zero trust, is essential to get buy-in from all the parties involved, from the grassroots on up to management. If you try to do it from top down, it's unlikely to go well. If the engineers on the ground that are implementing this are behind it, that'll help. If the people whose privileges are being perhaps reduced understand that it's not an affront to them, but an effort to make security better, that'll help. If upper management understands that this effort is going to take funding and long-term staffing changes, hiring and firing, that'll help, right? In other words, there's so many elements of this that aren't necessarily technologically related, that have to do with just the management of change and the cultural impact that it can have. To that extent, small wins and step-by-step approaches are really a good way to approach this. You know, starting with something, I won't call it small, but starting with one component of the system that's essential. For instance, identity management is a great way to get some wins in early to show that this program is going to work. And then from there, that's going to, facilitate access to funds and also soften the ground, if you will, for further changes that can benefit everyone. So,
sure. As a follow-up question, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges to the non-technological aspects of implementing zero trust?
Well, I would say in a government world, it's going to be a matter of funding. Obtaining funding is always difficult in any organization, but I think, obtaining funding for programs of this sort can be difficult in a government environment. There's always conflicting priorities. As important as cybersecurity people, we tend to think this is the number one priority, but there's other people, with other perspectives that they bring to this. So the funding priority is always probably the most difficult aspect of this, as is the sense that this could be there's just a natural resistance to change in any organization, and the larger the organization, the more resistance there is likely to be, and so I would say that funding and resistance to change are probably the two biggest challenges to be faced. The fact that the executive order does mandate agencies to come up with a plan and does set the tone, I think is a big help. But it's going to take a lot more than just a few pieces of paper from the White House, much as that is as essential as that is as a first step.
Yeah, and I'll just glom onto what Don said. Actually, I liked when Don was going down the path of, how do you make this? There's lots of people that have a different perspective on this, and how do you sell it to them and make, why it's important to them individually to get collective buy-in. Right. And really at Don's level, at my level, at Aaron Weiss, who's the CIO for the Department of the Navy's level, Tony Plater, who's the acting Cisco, and you could go all over. Basically we're trying to coach others to get them to understand why this is important, and why when it does get down to a funding discussion, why we need to do these things, which when you talk about culturally in the Navy and in the Marine Corps, we buy really expensive things. The Ford aircraft carrier is a very pricey piece of equipment, the Columbia class submarine, the Joint Strike Fighter, all these things that we see as the primary means and methods of warfare. Don used the warfare word when he was given his opening comments. It's the thing that I continue to come back to. So when you look at sort of the break of, I'll use why the principal cyber advisor sort of exists maybe in the first place, The CIOs of the world have been doing a really good job about bringing cybersecurity to the forefront and really in driving this home and making it important. What the PCAs are really trying to do is bring cyber up to par as a warfighting domain within the departments. Again, we build every piece of equipment that we have within the Department of Defense with the understanding that an adversary wants to sink it, shoot it out of the air, or blow it up, right? And there's certain fundamental design characteristics built into all of our weapon systems to make them more survivable. Yeah. We are now finding vulnerabilities in systems, cyber vulnerabilities, that can have as a great as an impact, if not a greater impact, than things that people would have done kinetically to these weapon systems. We have to get our warfighters to understand this, which then, once they understand the threats, once they understand the risk, once they understand adversary activity, then it makes it a little more appealing. Because, if I went to a shipbuilder and said, hey, I don't think we need that fire suppression system on your ship, they would have a visceral reaction to that because they know that's designed to put out a fire if they get engaged by a traditional kinetic weapon system. We need them to see things like identity and zero trust through the same lens. And the minute they do that, then this becomes very easy because it becomes a warfighting requirement. Right. I would say similarly in the commercial world that we understand that you have intellectual property and our adversaries want it. If that was sort of the fundamental design characteristics of a system to say, hey, I am building, banks, build vaults, because that's where they put money, because they know that's what ultimately some bad guy would want. And they're going to put it somewhere that's really hard to get and then have layers, defenses around it. We need to think about that the same way, particularly defense industrial based customers that are building things for the military. Hey, our adversaries absolutely want that information that you have. The designing of a system, and I know it's hard when we sort of backfit these things, but anything that's quote unquote net new, security, identity, zero trust. And again, what I like about zero trust is it's just we've sharpened the talking point just a little bit. It's gone from cybersecurity to, okay, we're talking about zero trust, which brings up some images. We know that there's some things that are involved with it. People begin to understand it a little bit better. The security guys get it much better. But now we can have a conversation with people that don't understand security principles. At least we can now talk in a language that they can hopefully understand. And that, again, I would argue that a lot of Don and I's job is simply translation and championing and buy-in, and because politics, right, Don? I mean, it would just be the politics of getting a lot of this stuff implemented is not easy.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that also is somewhat different about this cyber warfare is that, first of all, it takes place on a digital plane, so that's a little bit less vivid in people's minds than bombs. But the other approach that our enemies are taking is, a lot of people say, well, there's going to be a Pearl Harbor event that's going to change everyone's mind. Well, maybe. But I think what our real enemies are doing is they're going to use, and the phrase I use is barnacles rather than bombs. They're not going to bomb us with a big Pearl Harbor event that's going to trigger a huge, massive response. They're going to plant millions of little barnacles on all the ships, so to speak, poke little holes and tiny little leaks in everything, bit by bit by bit. And they're going to take the long view to slowly but surely, figuratively speaking, sink our ships, using a Navy analogy here. So I think that's one of the things that I think also is a way to get across to those that are in charge of funding and supporting zero trust, is that, it's unlikely to be as vivid in your mind, but it's just as important in the long term to deal with the barnacles and to keep our ship's hulls clean of all these little barnacles planted by our enemies and all the little pinhole leaks that they're going to poke in the hulls of the ships. So,
well said.
So, Chris, I have a question for you. The NSA's zero trust guidance calls for constant verification of everything accessing the network, whether that be a user, device, application, even just data transfer. And this kind of plays into all of the identity management work that you're doing at the Navy. Can you discuss how this guidance informs or affirms your efforts in this area?
Well, so NSA and the Cybersecurity Directorate is obviously the lead dog of the sled of what we're all trying to follow. I mean, they are the technical authorities. They understand the risks presented by our adversaries the best. I mean, it's their bread and butter. It's what they do all day long. So, of course, guidance that they put out, we all do our best to follow. We could sort of regurgitate the entire 15 minutes at the beginning of this conversation for all the reasons why that is challenging. There are best practices. Then we get into the resources requirements, all these other things. But they are certainly keeping abreast of the threat, looking at particular vulnerabilities that we share internally. There's things that we know that hopefully others don't know, and we do our best to react to those proactively as opposed to reactively. So again, Rob Joyce, who's over there right now, Ann Newberg, who came from that organization, going back to the cast of characters that have all basically worked together. And the good news there is, as Rob pushes out information, he's pushing out to known entities that have a trust relationship established with Rob, that understand that Rob's doing his best, and NSA is going to push out good guidance. How we adopt that guidance and how we roll it out is, of course, the $64,000 question, which gets back into all the things we've already discussed, resources. But when we take some of that information internally, what we do is we try and put it through kind of a risk calculator, which says the things that we're most concerned about are the things that we've obviously seen adversary activity being interested in. And once we take that, we pair it up with, if there's vulnerabilities to those systems that we're aware of, and that's kind of where we try to focus our efforts. Understanding that, to using the barnacle analogy, I'm never going to scrape all those barnacles off. It's just impossible. But I got to get the ones that are going to potentially impact me the most.
Sure. Don, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, Chris mentioned IP theft earlier, and I think that's one of the major issues that our enemies want, or one of the major pieces of information that they want from us. Our enemies don't look at the government and private industry separately. It's all just what they want from us, and they'll take it wherever they can get it. In fact, a few months ago, I put out something on LinkedIn. It was a set of list of Army equipment, or images of Army equipment that we use, or military equipment that we use, planes, jeeps, tanks, and so on, and then the ones that the Chinese have. But I removed the markings to indicate which one were American, which one were Chinese. And to the trained eye, maybe a military expert could tell them apart. But unless you really know tanks, and you really know jeeps, and you really know jet fighters, you really can't tell them apart. Could not be more excruciatingly obvious where they had gotten this information. So that's another difference in the cybersecurity warfare picture, is that they're not really differentiating between civilian targets and government targets. It's all a big target, and that's what they want from us, is whatever information they need to gain ascendancy over us.
And I'll pile on that a little bit, because I understand who the audience of our session is right now. It's a lot of us, right? We're kind of, I don't want to say we're speaking in an echo chamber, but it's the security people coming to listen to the security people. And for the people that have been in this space, I'm going to argue that neither Don nor I have said anything that's blowing anybody's hair back listening to the sound of our voice. I'm sure everybody listening that have said similar things, have had similar thoughts, have suggested similar things. So it's not that that I, as the PCA, am some savant within the Department of the Navy that has all the answers that is going to impact. But what I'm finding the job, particularly at this level, more is about is just being a champion for this and continuing to drive this forward. And this is why I continue to come back to the warfare discussion. And Don hit on it as well. None of these things are in themselves the thing that's going to change. It's not the identity strategy that's going to fix us. It's not getting a zero trust that's going to fix us, because, zero trust is just the next thing. It's not to say that it hasn't been around as an idea for a long time. Again, in the prep call, Don brought it up appropriately. People have been talking about this idea of zero trust for 20 years. But maybe the technology is now catching up with us to the fact that now zero trust is a little more realistic. Like, we have the things in place, and we can kind of begin to roll out a zero trust architecture because the building blocks exist now, which is important. But this is not the last security architecture discussion we are ever going to have. And one of the things that I beat up maybe the Department of Defense for is because it wasn't that long ago that this would have been a comply to connect discussion. right? And comply to connect was the thing that was going to save us. We were going to ensure that our machines were clean and checked, and we weren't going to allow them to connect to the network unless they were patched and scanned and all those things, because we didn't want anything dirty on our network. Well, we're coming to the conclusion that's a really, really hard task. Not that it's not possible. The Marine Corps was very aggressive in pursuing a comply to connect strategy. But it's sort of, as we get close to these things, we never fully rolled them out because we start chasing the next shiny thing. Not that zero trust is a shiny thing. I'm not trying to downplay zero trust at all. But, conceptually, would it be, if you're 60% into a comply to connect strategy, is it better to get to 100% or stop what you're doing and then try to pursue a zero trust strategy? And I think that's what really the debates are internal to a lot of these organizations, because there'll be something else. And using the examples of zero trust architecture started back in 2014, identity started back in 2014, and now we're just getting ready to roll something out 8 years later. How long is it going to take us to start rolling out a zero trust architecture at scale within the departments? Yeah. And that's something to be said. I use JRSS as a perfect example. JRSS is also already something we're starting to walk away from. The Navy never even got to rolling it out. That's how long it took for us to get around to doing JRSS, that all of a sudden it kind of became obsolete, that we begun to move to the next thing. So that the only thing that scares me with things like zero trust architectures is when we see this as the next new thing. And by the time we actually get to it, we're already thinking about the next thing. And we never quite finished the thing that we're on right now, whether it be JRS, whether it be comply to connect, whatever that is. Security, cybersecurity is attuned to the war on poverty, the war on drugs. These things are perpetual problems that are really never going to be solved. They can be managed, of course, but there's never going to be a security architecture that rolls out that our adversaries just go, well, they got zero trust. I guess we'll move on. I guess we're just going to close all our cyber shops and go home. I mean, that's never going to happen. So we just got to be realistic that this is just a perpetual problem that we need to manage, acknowledging that there's never going to be a silver bullet. Chris Cleary's humble opinion. There's never going to be a silver bullet security tool that comes out that just says, this is the only thing you're ever going to need, and move on.
Well, I think I gave a talk in Seattle recently for the Cloud Security Alliance, and my first definition of zero trust is that it's a mindset. It's a mindset change. It's not a matter of fixing everything. Like you said, we're never going to get there, but we can create a mindset of zero trust into which even partially finished projects can fit. For instance, comply to connect is not, you don't have to drop comply to connect just to be zero trust. I mean, at least not from a technical standpoint. Yeah. Most security technologies are commensurate with or supportive of zero trust. And if that provides sort of a North Star and a general mindset for approaching security, then I think that's where its value lies. You're never really going to get to, complete zero trust finish line, right? But you can adjust the mindset. And this is where the cultural change that I was talking about comes into play. The other thing that I think is essential to security, is zero trust and otherwise, is to start adapting a we can win approach. Too often we see the latest breach and everyone is appropriately reacting to fix the situation, but it's all reactive and it's all, oh my God, we're never really gonna, when's the next breach? We'll never win this. And I think that plays into the difficulty in attracting people into the profession, because who in their right mind wants to play for the losing team, right? I think we need, and in fact, next month, I'm doing a webinar with Simon Pavitt, who is senior official in cybersecurity in Britain. And the theme, and also with Brett Scott, who works for my company, and the theme will be, how do we create a winning mindset? The coach of the football team that wins did not go to his team and say, you know what, have you seen the other team's running game? And boy, their passing is killer. And their defensive line, forget about it. We're stuck. You don't, that's not the winning mindset. We need a winning mindset. And so to my way of thinking, I'm hoping that zero trust is a mindset change and an approach that changes people's attitudes as much as it triggers the implementation of new technologies. To that extent, I think it can be a comprehensive and long-term thing rather than a flash in the pan. It also doesn't preclude the use of any given, it includes almost any reasonable cybersecurity technology, whether it's identity management or comply to connect or whatever. So I'm hopeful that this is going to trigger a sea change or be part of a sea change in the attitude towards cybersecurity, so that we can agree that it's a chronic disease, but it can be managed.
So, in light of knowing that Zero Trust can't solve all cybersecurity problems, what would you guys say are some of the gaps in the Zero Trust approach to security that you believe don't serve your organization or federalization or federal agencies in general?
Well, I think the question is a little bit misleading because it implies that there is a Zero Trust approach. There are many different Zero Trust approaches. Several government agencies have put out their frameworks and their maturity models, et cetera. And also there are private industry approaches as well. There's a lot of overlap in those approaches, but sometimes you see gaps, as you mentioned. For instance, in the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, they put out a great document, 800-207. That's what a wonk I am. I actually know what the publication is called, the number of it. But interestingly, it doesn't really address encryption in place hardly at all, which is, I think, an important element of cybersecurity. Now, if you want to say that that's not part of Zero Trust, fine, but I still think you should encrypt your data, right? But then other approaches do talk about encryption in place quite a lot. So I think, each approach has its strengths and its weaknesses. And I think the key is not to take any approach as gospel, to look at them all and adopt what makes sense to you and look at what's achievable, in those approaches. One thing I don't see in any of the approaches that I think is an interesting omission in most of them is there's not much attention paid to threat intelligence. And I think that's an important element of any cybersecurity program, because if you don't really know what your threat environment is, it's a little bit hard to implement cybersecurity technologies and approaches that are, that are going to address those threats. If all of your efforts are around ransomware, and our nation states aren't implementing ransomware, they're doing data exfiltration. Well, you're probably missing the boat, right? You haven't assessed your threat landscape well. Private industry might need to concern themselves more with ransomware, whereas a government is going, especially top secret or confidential data in the government, they're going to be concerned about the data exfiltration, just for example. So my response to that would be, don't take any of them as gospel. They're all going to have their gaps and their strengths and weaknesses. NIST doesn't have the data encryption or encryption in place piece. And also threat intelligence, I think, is underrepresented in all of the approaches. So,
yeah, perspective. Yeah,
I don't know if I have too much more to add on what Don added, because I agree with him. I'm not a NIST wonk. I don't spend all my time in that document. But again, what I will say is I'll go down the threat piece of this, because I think what our adversaries are doing a really, really good job of is eroding, or their strategy may be our erosion of our confidence and our availability of our systems when we need them. And when you look at this sort of we've got some new language that the Department of Defense uses. We call it a kind of this continuum, this conflict continuum. And we're all talking about this conflict competition, which is below the level of armed conflict, right? We stay in this kind of poking at each other game, whether we're taking intellectual property, whether we're making endeavors into understand the infrastructure of our adversaries. Our adversaries are doing a good job of understanding our infrastructure. And it's sort of the making us consider our opening moves when we are going to question the availability of certain things that we may need, or the longevity of those things, the availability of them over time, as an example. Like, I know the lights are on right this minute, and when we go to do whatever we're going to do right out of the gate, the lights will be on. Can I guarantee the lights are going to be on tomorrow, right? Are those the things that I begin to question? My ability to move supplies around the Pacific theater of operation, petroleum, fuel oil, food, repair, all these other things and the critical infrastructure that I depend on to use those things. So when it gets into once again, the gaps and seams, I'm not as in the weeds of say that there's a particular problem with the zero trust architecture. I think Don actually did a really good job covering some of those. I would say the gaps and seams in a larger warfighting construct, and how does security of everything from the availability of information systems, Zoom, Teams, the way I'm going to communicate, all the things we're doing right now, to the way that I'm going to move around logistics, to the way that I'm going to engage with command and control systems, communicating with weapon systems, the delivering of munitions, all the, and again, there's everything from the production of that munition, the delivery of it, and ultimately its employment, all have certain dependencies on information systems and critical infrastructure that our adversaries figuring out. It's the soft or underbelly. That I'm a war college graduate. I'm a dyed in the wool. 30-inch paces and, military born and bred and trained, classically trained military officer. And when you get into Clausewitz and stuff like that, and we all know the line that says, war is just the continuation of politics, war is the continuation of politics through other means. But the real idea of war is simply to get your adversaries to do what you want them to do. We've always seen that through the lens of kinetic actions, of conflict, of warfare, which has always been the definition of, two armies or navies meeting each other on a battlefield and duking it out. Warfare is changing. Warfare is moving away from the things kinetically, because I simply just got to get into my adversary's gray matter and make him do what I want him to do, him or her to do. And I think this is why we're getting into the importance of cybersecurity, which now is going to cover all sorts of avenues, because not only is it the availability of information and the integrity and the confidentiality of that information, but it's in the other ways people use information. We see it through misinformation and false information and deep fake and all that other stuff. I'm going down a rabbit hole, not necessarily related to zero trust, but when we start coming back to the foundational things we need to do to avoid all of that, you then come back to this discussion. And then this discussion becomes more important for leaders, and then leaders drive resources to it. And I think the point that I was trying to make, actually, Don said it a little bit better than I did, I would admit. It's not that using the comply to connect thing, it's not that comply to connect is not part of that architecture. It's just all of a sudden people think comply to connect is no longer a thing, and then they start reducing resources going to that to move over. And that's kind of more what I was getting at. Yeah. Not that comply to connect is not a fundamental component of it, but you still got to pay for those things. Yeah. And ultimately somebody say, oh, we don't do comply to connect anymore. Let's put a line through that and we'll move on to the next thing with a failure understanding. No, that is still core to what we're trying to do. You can't kill that off because the words don't fit this new zero trust narrative. They absolutely do. And once again, I think that's more of the fight. So, for those people listening to this call, the people that are going to approach, me with technology solutions, it's, you understand the world that I live in, which is that of resources and competing priorities. Not that there's not a lot of great tech out there. I know there is. It's kind of picking the wheat from the chaff and then getting the resource sponsors to appropriately put resources against those.
So I think we have time for one more question to wrap us up today. This is for both of you. What would you say are the commonalities between federal and commercial security guidance around zero trust? And how does this inform your own approach to cybersecurity? And if so, how? Or if not, why?
As I said earlier, the cultural change is going to be common to all organizations. I mean, there's resistance to change, and there's a suspicion of new approaches that may affect my job or my status in the organization. And that's true whether you're in private industry or the government. The cultural change is always a difficult thing to do. And big organizations, in my view, are in many ways big organizations, whether it's a big government or a big company. There's a lot of human behavior that's the same across the board. So I think that's probably the most salient similarity between government and commercial industry in dealing with the zero trust implementation. More specifically, identifying what data is important and what resources are essential to the mission is difficult for any large organization. And the difference is that, in private industry, the mission is to make money. In the government, the mission will vary according to what that agency's or Department of Defense's mission might be. Department of Defense is to defend the country. The Department of Labor is to ensure labor standards are implemented, and Department of Justice to implement justice. These aren't money making endeavors. So in that respect, they can be different. But what's similar is that if any program of this scope can align with mission enablement, whether it's profit or the specific mission of a government agency, that's going to get the attention of and backing of senior management to free up the funds that are always the essential element to make this kind of thing happen. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So there. Off to you, Chris.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have a ton to add on to that. I will simply say that when you look at what the federal government's designed to do, particularly the Department of Defense, and what commercial industry is designed to do, Don laid that out pretty clearly. What I would say is what I'm concerned about is when the battleground shifts. Right, a lot of the fight right now is in the commercial sector. Protecting those things. That's where the money is, right? If the bad guys, if the Russian business network and the people doing ransomware are looking for ransom, they're going to go to the people who have the money and the people that can provide those resources. If the Chinese and other countries that are looking for intellectual property to build things or compete with us economically, they're going to go and take that stuff. And I think so. And I'll call it the fight. The fight is heavily weighted over on the commercial side, and because that's again where our adversaries are spending most of their intentions. It's when it shifts. As we get closer to, God forbid, conflict, and we start seeing some of those effects bleed over or be directed at us intentionally within the department to, again, question our own ability to do the things that we as a department are designed to go to sea and, project power from the sea, whether it's through the forms of Marines or airstrike or whatever. That's the job of the Navy. And it's this dance between our dependencies on the commercial world. And that's one of the things that we're mostly concerned about now. There are things that are outside our purview that we just do not control, that happen in commercial companies and critical infrastructures that are owned by private organizations that are not, publicly funded sort of things. We don't control any of that. But is this one time that we should be getting together and having similar reference architectures, because when we would have to respond into those environments, it would be environments that were somewhat familiar to us because we understand how they're being designed and built, which would allow us to respond.
I am encouraged, though. I do think that there is a sea change in the attitude about cybersecurity in the nation as a whole and the government, and slightly more specifically. I think that it can happen because it must happen. We have to get this done. And it requires a mindset change, and it requires an attitude of positivity. It doesn't mean that we're Pollyannas and think that everything's going to go well, but we have to at least have the confidence that it can go well if we approach this correctly. And that's what I would like to leave our audience with, is that, mindset change and can-do attitude. That's what I like to settle on. So.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today to discuss Zero Trust and cybersecurity. We really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. So thank you again.
Thank you, Kate. All right.